This is an AQA Psychology A-level revision video for the paper 1 topic of attachments with a specific focus on caregiver-infant interactions. So let's have a look at where this fits in the bigger picture on the specification. Caregiver-infant interactions in humans is the first bullet point on the specification for attachments. The caregiver-infant interactions you are expected to be able to know and evaluate are reciprocity and interactional synchrony. So to be able to understand caregiver-infant interactions, we need to look briefly at how we as researchers measure attachments. So that they are usually through methods such as observations and self-report methods, which are interviews and questionnaires. And there are different ways of knowing whether caregiver and infant have strong attachment to one another, which are seeking proximity, so wanting to be near each other, getting upset when apart, and being comforted or being willing to be comforted upon reunion. So definitions of reciprocity and interactional synchrony are on the screen. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and note down the definitions whilst I talk and explain what we mean by them. So reciprocity is when caregiver and infant interact by being reciprocal, hence the name reciprocity. They respond to each other's signals and they gain a response from one another. So it's a bit like a conversation. They go back and forth, they do it at different times, they respond to one another, and they might be doing similar but often different gestures or behaviours. Whereas interactional synchrony is where they interact in sync. So caregiver and infant reflect or mirror the actions and emotions of each other, and they do this in a coordinated and synchronized way, so often at the same time performing similar actions. Looking at reciprocity in more detail then, research has shown that babies give signals that are picked up on 2/3 of the time, and reciprocity is really important for interaction and attachment and bonding, so both must pick up and respond to each other's signals. There is the still face experiment, if you wanted to just do a quick YouTube search of that shows just how important reciprocity is. So the still face experiment is where that caregiver does not, sorry, I don't know what I'm doing here, I need to highlight. It's where the caregiver has a still face, there's no interaction, and it's about looking at how the infant responds to that, and often the infant gets very distressed because reciprocity is important. You have to respond to each other's signals for that bonding element. So a piece of research here, Brazelton, it's just brief and important to understand that reciprocity is much like a dance, because when a couple dances, they respond to each other's moves, they do different moves at different times with one another, a bit like a dance-off, if you like. You do one action to gain a response from the opposing team, and they do what they think is a better action in response. So, of course, infant and caregiver aren't having a dance-off, but they are dancing with one another, they're interacting, they're responding to each other's communication signals. And it's really important to acknowledge that traditional views saw the infant as passive, and that the parent had to make all the effort in forging an attachment. But actually, reciprocity and Brazelton et al. Show that interactions are reciprocated and not one-sided. So the baby is actually much more active in forming the attachment than first suggested. Moving on now to interactional synchrony. So by definition, it is when caregiver and infant reflect both the actions and emotions of each other in a coordinated and synchronized way. So you can see the image below, which is linked to the key study we will look at shortly. So research shows that those who display interactional synchrony have higher quality attachments. That's what research suggests, and that's what we can move on to evaluate after we have looked at the APFC of this key study here, which was by Maltzoff and Moore in 1977. So Maltzoff and Moore wanted to examine interactional synchrony in infants. They used a controlled observation, as you can see here from these videotape recordings, these still images. They had 2 to 3 week old infants and their caregivers, their mothers often, in the 70s, thinking about it would most likely be the mother due to societal factors. And the mother would display 3 different gestures. So you've got tongue protrusion, sticking the tongue out, mouth opening like a gasp, and lip protrusion, which is pouting. And as you can see, mirrored here in each of the images by the infant. So in more detail, we have the APFC on screen, and it's really important to note that later research by Maltzoff and Moore 6 years later found the same findings, but this time in 3-day-old infants. And we will revisit that when we look at the AO3 shortly. So this is an opportunity to pause the video and get down some key points for the APFC of this study. I'm just going to go ahead and continue highlighting some things in yellow which I want you to consider for the AO3 of this study. So opportunity to just pause and reflect on what we've covered so far, particularly the Maltzoff and Moore study, as we will be moving on to evaluate this research. So this is an opportunity for you to pause the video 1 through to 7. Are they true or are they false? And if they're false, you need to correct them. In 5 seconds, we'll go through the answers. So statements 1 and 2 are true. It was conducted by Maltzoff and Moore, and the participants in the study were 2 to 3 week old babies and their mothers. Statement 3 is false. The adult pulled 3 distinct faces rather than 2, as the statement suggests. Number 4 is true. It was recorded, which is why we were able to use those images in the previous slide. They were taken from the actual study itself. Statement 5 is false. In a later study, similar findings were found with 3-day-old babies. And again, that's something we're going to look at when we do the AO3 in a moment. Number 6 is also false because the study found that infants do display interactional synchrony. And number 7 is true. Research has suggested and found babies with interactional synchrony have a higher quality attachment with their caregiver. So thinking about how to evaluate this research, think about the research methods and how you can use your knowledge of research methods, and also think about the difficulties that researchers might encounter when studying caregiver-infant interactions in babies. Jot down your thoughts, and in 5 seconds we will examine these AO3 points in more detail. So controlled observations are good because hopefully you thought about the fact that they'd filmed it, they'd been able to check for reliability and compare findings with other researchers, review the footage to make sure that what they're seeing is accurate. However, it is hard to know what's happening when observing infants, especially 3-day-olds and 2 to 3 week olds, because it's not uncommon for infants to randomly pull facial gestures. You know, they're still getting used to all their sort of new muscles in their face and their body, etc. Furthermore, we can't ask the infant, why did you pull that face? We can't find out the purpose of interactional synchrony and reciprocity. However, the study was replicated on 3-day-old infants, which does suggest that these interactions are innate and that they are used to develop an attachment, as Maltzoff and Moore and other researchers like Brazelton have suggested. So here are some AO3 points in more detail based on what we have just gone through. That would conclude the end of this video, so I'll leave those points there for you to use as AO3. And thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful.